Welcome to today's webinar on active learning, part 3. And now I'd like to welcome Kathee Scoggin, our presenter.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Katie. Okay. Oh, and thanks for the claps. I just wanted to let you know that we are going to go back and finish up some of the stuff we were talking about last week, for sure, because you need to have more information to decide how to help a student access the learning environment and how to sometimes create a learning environment very specific to that student. And so we talked about the space for active learning, and we talked about Lily Nielsen and that she calls the thing that she has devised and done a lot of research on the little room. And we call it a space for active learning because we have done it a little bit differently and want to respect her in that area. So the picture that you see, one of the things I'd like you to remind you is that we will once again have a Survey Monkey later towards the end of the session, and would ask that you give us some feedback so that it gives us information about how to make this more valuable to people. Also want to remind you that on the outline form that you got, there were a bunch of resources after where you could write in your notes, and I'll refer you, but I'm not going to list out them, but lilyworks.com is one in which you can actually take a look at the types of materials that that Lily Nielsen has produced, and this is actually a company now where you can purchase certain things from. You can also make them. So just so we're all kind of clear about that piece, I want to mention this is a very tall space for active learning, and this was specifically designed for a child who could go in with in a prone stander and explore things, or for a child who is in a wheelchair. And one of the things you can do is actually adjust the height of those materials. So you're seeing them hang up fairly high in that picture, but that is not necessarily the only way you can do it. You can drop them down much lower to get closer to the student. Okay, so let's see. I want to show you a couple things since we're talking about the elastic, and that is people ask me questions about the elastic, and I want to show you a very wide piece of elastic, and then here's a narrower piece of elastic, and then there's even the string elastic that gets very, very thin, and I'll show that one also so you can take a look at that. The reason we suggest that you look at different pieces of elastic and different strengths is that for some of your students they're much stronger, and therefore the wider elastic forces them to have to use more of it. For some of our students who don't have a lot of strength, the very thin elastic works really well. The other thing, so when you're hanging stuff, you can hang it from any height you want. There are holes in the top of that space for active learning, and what I like to do is actually use something that's called a cord stop. All of you've probably seen one. You put it around, your hood in the wintertime, and you can bring it up real tight. It's just, you get it at a sewing store, Joann's, Fabrics, Michael's, those kinds of places. That way, it's very easy for me to adjust it up or down so that if the student is in the prone stander at one point, but then I'm going to put the student in their wheelchair at another point, I can easily drop from the top. As long as I make the elastic long enough, I can drop it down. So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. I'm going to kind of interject things that I found have worked or not worked in some cases very well with the space for active learning. Okay, what I'd like to do is start off with a video that we had hoped to show last week. And this is a little girl's first experience in a space for active learning. And what I'd like you to do is take a look at how she is when she's not in the space for active learning, and what kinds of things you see happening when she is in a space for active learning. This was the first time. So push play now. Okay. One of the things that I noticed a couple people were making comments and is that what was sound important to Andy Rose? Now this is her first time to be in there. I don't know a lot about Andy, but what I do know is that when she would stop, and we talked about this in previous weeks, is sometimes when a child stops, it's really about them processing or listening. The purpose of the Space for Active Learning is to have one top and three sides, and that is to keep the sound inside as well as try to dampen some of the sound coming from outside. So sometimes I will say to somebody, gee, when is a good time when there maybe are fewer students or it's quieter in your room that it would make sense for the child to be in a Space for Active Learning or Lily Nielsen's little room? Because that's one of the things you want to think about. Does this child have hearing? Does he or she respond? They may have hearing. They may not process spoken language, but they may have hearing enough that they would respond to sound. And that helps you determine what kinds of items to put in to that Space for Active Learning. So one thing that you might have noticed is that Andy Rose got a couple things twisted up. She was really excited and she was really playing with the Mylar and the bell, and all of a sudden some things started to twist around. So what I'd like to do is show you something. This is just tubing that you can buy at like Ace Hardware Store or whatever. And the nice thing about it is, I'll show you one I've already done. I just threaded the elastic through it. That way when they're hanging down, they can't twist around each other, which does become a problem for some kids. It isn't always a problem, but it's a nice thing to be able to do. So at the top, where we talked about there are holes in the top of that little room or that Space for Active Learning. So this would come out and this would be on top of that hole sitting on it so that you can adjust and make it taller or shorter. And then this is hanging down with the actual toy hanging at the bottom. So if I have a toy, and I'll just use this one as an example, here's a Hoberman ball, and I want to connect it. I'm connecting it here, and then this is the thing that's going up through the ceiling of the little room or the Space for Active Learning. So those are some things you can do to try to help the child not have things get so twisted that they can't make things happen the way we wanted to. And did you notice people talking directly to her, working with her, putting their hands into the Space for Active Learning? If you noticed that, would you put a green check? If you thought nobody was interacting with her, put a red X. Right. You know, one of the things Lily Nielsen says is, she said, when the child goes into the little room, you shut up. she's a fairly blunt person. And the reality of it is the more I talk to the child or physically engage with the child while they're in the space for active learning, then the more confused the child is as to whether or not I'm the one who is making things happen or they're the one who is making things happen. And many of us have cause and effect on goals and objectives. This is a great way to work on cause and effect because nothing happens in that little room unless the child makes it happen. And that's a very important aspect. And the idea is, and I think I said this last week too, was, you know, if the child can't come to the whole big room we're in, then I'm going to bring the room to them. And one of the things we see children do is they start exploring, where are the boundaries of this little room or this space for active learning? So keep that in mind as we are talking, and what I'd like to do is show one more space for active learning, and I believe a full-length videotape. By that I mean probably 3 or 4 minutes, is up on our website at the WSDSonline.org. But keep in mind that I'd like you to see the fact that it may grow with the child. So please notice that the first space for active learning is smaller than the second space, and the child is doing some different things. So let's take a look at that and see what kinds of things changed between the first space for active learning and the second. So let's find that, push the play button at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. The screen's kind of a blue, and push play now.
You know.
What about this? Is that the same thing? Same thing. This way, Karen. He really needs a lot of those here. He really does. The marker. What about this? Is that the same thing? Same thing. This way, Karen. He really needs a lot of those here. He really does.
The slinky was one of Christopher's favorite things, and if I had known about the tubing that I mentioned, that is definitely one I would have used, because the slinky kept getting mixed up, and I don't interfere with the child if, like, some of the elastic gets round around their finger and stuff. I mean, if the finger starts turning blue, you know, of course I do. But in general, I'm amazed at students who are not very active can figure out a way to solve problems about getting things off their fingers. It amazes me. But in this case, I would have dropped the tubing down with the elastic in it, because it would have kept that from getting all tangled up. So for Christopher, we did a 2-foot by 2-foot room, and then we did a 3-foot, actually a 4-foot by 4-foot space for active learning. And when you see the video on the website, you'll see that actually the team then developed an even larger room for him to be exploring, because he was then sitting up. They had put a box in it for him to move around in it. So you can see the way people will start to grow and change things. You can see that the items were different in the one space for active learning than the other. We had found things that the student particularly liked. One of the things we found is, and when we look at the forms, the data collection forms, you'll see this, we found out that he was actually sequencing. and he was picking up a flashlight and banging it against the wall of the Space for Active Learning. Then he would grab this tube of lotion, which he couldn't get the lid off, but he would tap it against his teeth. And then he would grab for the cup, the plastic cup we had drilled a hole in, and he would bring it to his mouth. It's a perfect place for children to be able to use authentic kinds of items, everyday items that you're wanting them to use. For example, when he's getting a drink, or a spoon for feeding himself, or a toothbrush. All those kinds of things you can hang in there, and the child gets an opportunity to play. That's another major point that that Lily Nielsen has really taught me, and that is you don't learn to use a toothbrush by practicing brushing your teeth. You actually learn through play. And most of us learn through watching somebody else brush their teeth. But the whole idea is that children learn all of this through play. They don't learn it through that exact functional skill we're trying to teach them at that moment. So the idea of giving students lots of opportunities to explore those without us trying to show them the right way to use it in the beginning. Okay, let's go on. So here are questions I get often. So I've made a space for active learning, the child's in there. Now here are my questions. When do I take the items out? When do I put items in? What do I take out? When do I move the items? What kinds of skills to work on? All of those are great questions, and it all goes back to collecting some data. You need to collect some data in order to know when it is time to do that. And I'll give a few examples too as we go through this. This is the first data collection form, and you all got these sent to you last week, not for today, but last week. And this was just something that was made up. Each square represents one of the holes in the top of the space for active learning. You can put as many holes in there as you want, but you want to go ahead and design something like this. And then on the first line inside the first box, if that hole has something hanging down from it, you identify what it is. So I'm going to go to the next one because this is just slightly different. And the reason we did this was we were having someone collect some data for us, and there are some high school students who have disabilities who are now doing data collection because they could identify whether or not the child just looked at it, or if the child batted it, or if the child grasped it, got their hand on it, or they did something else with it, such as taking it from one hand and putting it into the other hand. So this was easy for us to do. This is not hard to do at all. So this is an example of one. So in each hole, now you'll notice some things were not identified. If we look on the first one, it says a yellow pom-pom, and it identifies how many times the child batted at it and how many times the child grasped it. This is about hand use and about my controlling. In the beginning, for some of the kids, we need to remember that it may be unintentional. It's pre-intentional. The child just happened to touch it, and that's all. And it's like, whoa, what was that? But as time goes by, we start seeing that child intentionally start to do something. And you can't have communication, and you can't have a lot of skills that you and I talk about all the time doing with our students if there's not something intentional on their part. In the beginning, it may be accidental, and that's okay. I make sure that everything is within about 1/8 of an inch of the child's body, so all they have to barely do is slightly move before they come into contact. You also saw Christopher with shoes on. That was a long time ago. I'd take the shoes off. If I can roll the pants up so that the legs come in contact. In the summertime when it's warm, get a short sleeve shirt or no shirt at all. The more contact the student has, the better. We've also put students on wedges because they had back issues, scoliosis. We've put them on the side for sideline for some children. So you may decide that, oh, sideline. Well, that means that if I look at this data collection form, I might not have anything in a whole side, one whole column or two, because we're only doing sideline, and the child can only get to the 6 or the 8 that are on the other side. So that's why it's important for you to know, where did I put it, what did I put in there. So if you look at this example, what would you say are what is this child's favorite items from what you can see here? Just type it in the chat box. And I'm hoping you can see it well enough. And if you can't, just tell me. Okay, the pom-pom, the yellow pom-pom definitely is one. And the jingle bell is probably the other that has the most. Yeah, great. So that gives me some information. So as time goes along, one of the things I want to look at is, okay, so is the small jingle bell on the ribbon really that interesting to the child? Or is it where his or her hand can move the most? So I might take one of those, just one, shift it to one of the squares or the holes next to it, and find out whether or not the child can find it. It may be close enough that it won't be a big deal for them. We changed this once for Christopher. He loved yellow pom-poms, and what we did is, after a while, the aide moved the pom-pom, and he got into the little room, or the space for active learning, and what was great was you could see the look on his face, like he put his hand up and it wasn't there, and he's like going like, what? Like, what's going on? What was very cool is he put both his feet up and kind of walked his way around the walls of that space for active learning until he found it. And when he reached up and found it, you could just see like, ah, this is good. This is good. I found it. So now I know that that child has some spatial memory, which tells me another piece that I can't get from some special kind of test. There is no test that we can get some of this information on this group of students. And so that's part of the reason for this, is we get to find out. Okay, so that's the data collection. I want to go a little bit further on the data collection, and you guys have copies of it. I think that Michaela may have sent it out as a PDF form, which means you can't do much with it. If you decide that you really would like a copy of that, if you'll just email her, we'll send it out in like a Word format so that you can adjust it to however you want to. You're more than welcome to use these if you find them helpful. And if you have more holes than what those boxes are, then just create another column. It works great. So this is something that we started looking at, is the idea of goals and objectives, and writing the goals and objectives in such a way that, oh gosh, now I want John to tolerate being in the space for active learning for 10 minutes, okay? That's not the goal. The goal is, what is it we want the child to be able to do outside the little room? We want the child to have opportunities to be active in their own way without us interfering or cutting the activity short. And then as time goes by, we want them to start to get some concepts. Oh, this thing's heavier than this thing. This one is shiny. This one makes noise. This one doesn't make noise. Those are things that we want them to start to get and to understand. So one of the things I'd like to do is show you on here. I've written the different kinds of actions and concepts that are demonstrated so that you could fill this form out, you with the team or whoever's doing the data collection for the child. You can fill some of this out so it starts to give you ideas of, I saw some people said, gosh, I really want to do more meaningful activities. This will help you understand what are the more meaningful activities. How can I use it? So if Christopher loves yellow pom-poms, how can I use yellow pom-poms in an activity that is more meaningful to him? Maybe it's numbers, and it's 1 yellow pom-pom and 2 yellow pom-poms and 3 yellow pom-poms instead of me using something that he has absolutely no interest in. So that's part of that meaningful activities. Gonna just, and this is an example, and you have that example of what might be filled in and what are the things that I find out the child can do. That I can say, you know, this child does match, and Christopher did. We had 2 yellow pom-poms in, and those are the only times he brought both of them together. He didn't do that with any other objects, which was very interesting. And when we asked a couple people, they said, yeah, we think he is matching when he is interested in matching. And I hear people say, oh, well, I love doing it. You know, he likes doing what he likes to do when he likes to do it. Well, part of it is that it's interesting. It's more meaningful. So what do I use in the space for active learning or on some of the other things that I'm going to show you? This little girl is lying on a resonance board, which we're going to talk about. But do you notice what does everything on that resonance board seem to be made of? Please type in the chat window. Plastic. And that's one of the biggest issues we have is so many times, especially with younger children, people buy things that are plastic, and that's all they buy. It's plastic toys that make noise or music, etc., instead of looking for a variety of things. So I just put that up as an example. Please remember that we are grateful to everybody who's allowed us to use these videos. This is not a criticism of the family or the therapist or anybody. So please keep that in mind when you're thinking through this. So, stringy items. Why are stringy items important? Stringy items are important because for some of our children, either their hands are very small because they're little, okay, or they may have contractures or some physical thing that does not allow them to take both hands and grasp an item. The stringy things that you see hanging here are all things that they can get their fingers go into, caught in, and by caught I mean you don't uncatch them. In most cases they can always uncatch themselves, but it gives them a chance to start to use it. And what we sometimes see is people will put splints on, and once again, this is not anything against splints, but we have found that when we take them off in a space for active learning, that child naturally starts to open those fingers as long as the items are small enough and interesting and texturally interesting enough. So there are glass beads, wooden things, soft things, and the item that's in the center that looks like a long snake, that actually changes shape. So I'll use this as an example. So this is a Hoberman ball, and it changes shape. That's another one of those concepts we want kids to get, is things can change shape. Let me keep going here. Things that are made of rubber, things that are magnetic, things that are made of metal. Metal is cold and it tends to be heavier. Things that are soft. For some students, everything has to be soft. Over in the left-hand side of the screen, that's a wooden necklace that's made out of wooden stars and things. And I do have plastic in there, so I'm not saying you can't use plastic, but think in terms of what are all the things you can do. Everyday functional type items. Those are also fun to play with. Some are plastic, some are not. Wooden things, a back scratcher, an embroidery hoop. You know, I have found those, like a lot of things at Michael's that are made of wood, which is helpful, because sometimes it's hard to find things anymore. Everything seems to be made of plastic. Also things that are shiny. Using a flashlight on the shiny part of my first big learning book attracts children's attention. Balls that make sound, anything that is shiny is another one, or has that bright yellow look to it. Works really well for some kids. Things that vibrate. can be also hung or put on some of the materials that I'm going to show. So a lot of these are vibratory. A reminder that if I have a piece of corrugated cardboard and my fingers run down it, that is vibratory. I think sometimes we get lost in the vibrating part that has a battery to it and stuff. But beads have a vibratory quality to them as long as it's something consistent. Bricks of a building, if you run your hand along the bricks of the building, that has a vibratory quality. And I'm just throwing these out because I want you to think about all the different things that are possible. So now I got us back up. I have one last video to show. It's a little bit longer, and I'd like you, I think it's almost 3 minutes. So I'm explaining something, so we'll just watch that video and then move on to other things. But I want you to know that you really have to pay attention to what the child likes. The concept of a space for active learning is not about making this a torture chamber. You find the things that the child likes. In fact, you play with the child, find out if they like it, and then you put it in the space for active learning. If you're experimenting and you don't know much about that child, pay attention. Again, use that data collection form of, gosh, as soon as he touched it, his hand was out of there. He didn't want anything to do with it, and I've done this 4 days in a row, and the same thing happens all 4 days. Well, gosh, how about I move that and put in something I know he likes? Okay, so let's go down to the lower left-hand screen and push play now.
One is a little girl living in Washington. The only thing she would touch was cloth diapers. She would actually lie on her stomach on the floor and keep her hands up and her legs up and feet up, almost like she was jumping out of an airplane and parachuting down. And she would not touch things, not even people's hands. And they called me back and said, she screams the whole time, so we took her out, and I said, that makes sense. So I arrived, and they had all these different wonderful things, and I said, let's take everything out. So what I did was I took all cloth diapers, and we put them in different kinds of shapes, and actually hung them so that she would only be touching cloth diapers. So one of the things we started with is she got in the little room and she started crying, but we had these close enough to her body, and she had a little short sleeve shirt and shorts on so that her body was really accessible to the feel of the cloth diapers. We kept them very close to her. And she had an option of this one we had just tied into a clump. This one we actually tied from corners so that eventually we could put items inside. We also just had one in half, and each one of these change in such a way that the child starts to explore it in a little bit different way. So for about a month, the family did that with her, and she was very much enjoying it. Actually, they called me and they said, she's really loving it. And I said, great. Now I want you to go ahead and I want you to sew a couple little jingle bells on one of these shreds. Don't do a bunch of them, just do a couple. And of course, the first time they put that one in and she was in there, she came to the one and it made a little jingle sound. And it was like, ooh. And she pulled back, and she didn't like the feel of it. It was metal, and she wasn't used to that. But what the family said to me is that very quickly she started to go back and explore that and tolerate the jingle bell. So they sewed more jingle bells on it. The other thing they did was they actually put an item that she sleeps with right into that item was there, and one day she was playing with it and it happened to drop out, and it was right on top of her, and of course she jumped a little, but she actually started to explore it. Within another month there were actual other items hanging down that tended to be soft but had lace to them. They had some other textures to them than just the cloth diapers. So that's what we're looking for, is how do we get her to range out and explore more and more items, because her being totally blind means that she is needing to be able to use her hands. And if she won't touch anything that isn't a cloth diaper, then her options of really learning about her world and developing concepts and language are greatly diminished.
So it's about starting where the child is. And if the child has some things they don't like, then start with what they do like. And then slowly introduce some other things to start to make them go, okay. And I don't make the child do anything in that space for active learning. I don't put my hand in. I don't try to show them anything. However, I can take any of those items or duplicate items of exactly the same thing, and we can play with them. We can talk about them. I can show them how the slinky goes back and forth, even though in the space for active learning, the child maybe doesn't understand that. You can do anything outside of that space for active learning or Lily Nielsen's little room, either before or after. It is while the child is in that space that you let them be the boss. They're the controller. So that's a major piece. And we also talked last week about what are all the reasons. And also, how do you explain this to a family? How do you explain this to an administrator? How do you explain, gosh, I want them to do that, and because ultimately they're going to understand things, be more willing to explore things. And the child does not have to be blind in order to use this space. They may have their vision may be fine, their hearing may be fine. Let's go back to Andy Rose, the little girl that we saw in the first video. It looked pretty clear to me that she was doing some listening, and she certainly liked the things that were making sound. That's another thing that you find out about doing it. Okay? So what is something, for those of you who are thinking about access to an environment in which they might be able to do something, think in terms of what would I put in there? Why? Why would I put that in there? Because John's sister told me he loves that. He loves those things. Or the mom, or the grandmother, or the dad, or whoever tells you those things. So you want to think about that. And do I fill every one of those holes in the very beginning? Well, for some children, the answer is yes. For other children, it's absolutely no. For some of you who may be working with a child with cortical vision impairment, meaning their eyes are working okay, it's that the interpretation in the brain is different, I might not start with that many. The other thing people often do is they pick up the child or move the child into the little room or the active learning space. Instead of tipping it back, putting the child down, and then tipping the space for active learning or little room over the top, because if I push the child in, then their head's going to bump into all those things. That's not going to be very delightful in any way, shape, or form. So that's another thing that I try to tell people, don't push them into it, or bring that whole thing back and then lay it on top of the child. So onward and upward. So we're going to talk about what are some other things besides a space for active learning. If you're working with young children, you especially want to think about, gosh, if this is going to be at home, does the family have a big enough space in order to do this? That's going to be one of the questions. If it's going to be in a preschool classroom, is there room in that preschool classroom? Are there 3 or 4 children who would all benefit? Then I might make that space for active learning a little different so that I could lift the top off and put another one on top so that one would belong to one child and one would belong to another child. You don't put the kids into the same one for obvious germ reasons, if nothing else, but also because they may not like the same things. Also the size of the child. So those are some things you have to think about if you're going to use a space for active learning. So let's look at some other things. This is called a Velcro vest, and it's just a vest it's a vest you can get from Goodwill, and then just run Velcro strips down and across that you can put Velcro onto a toy or some item, a toothbrush, whatever, and you can put on. The thing I like about it is some children are really close to their body almost all the time, and therefore they don't do a lot of reaching out in the first place. Well, if I have that child sitting someplace, then I can actually put the things on there that I want to put on there. And it might even be 2 representations, I'm just going to make this up, 2 representations for songs that we sing at Circle. And the one that he touches first, that's the song we're going to sing, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, whatever. So that that child can be a part of the activity too. This can be used with an older student as well as a younger student. We sometimes will use aprons or smocks that have the Velcro on it. So let me show you what. This is called Veltex. It's a material that is Velcro friendly. I mean, you can buy it and make it more fancy, but you can just get one from Goodwill that fits the child too. And then these are items. So that if this child's only using his right arm and his right hand, I might have 2 things over on the right side for him to play with and nothing on the left side yet. If that child crosses midline, then that's different. If that child tends to keep one hand over here, then I may put them here. That's another nice thing about being able to move it around. But instead of that child just having his body to interact with, he actually has some toys, some items, toothbrush, whatever. Okay? So keep in mind, I just noticed that somebody wrote down about, love the idea for story time. It's a perfect thing. If there's some different things that are happening in story time, then those items can be there. And maybe one of the other students would put their hand under this child's and come up and take that item off. And they all end up in a box. And the next day, some child gets to pick them up and stick them all over the vest. And if the child's capable of doing that, that's great too. So those are things that you can consider doing. Once again, we're looking for some form of active learning and engaging, about learning about how things feel, what's heavy, what's light, what's wet, what's cold. There was a little girl who really liked cold things, and so we stuck stuff in the freezer and we would hang them down in the space for active learning because she loved things that were cold. So the purpose is to facilitate exploration, hand and finger grasp use when the child's hands are close to the body, and for some of our children, they don't want to bring their hands out. I think you all saw last week when we had Kaylee, she had her little, I call it the little chicken wing thing, like she'd put her hand in here every time because she wasn't sure she wanted to do what somebody else wanted her to do. When the child's sitting and waiting for something to happen and or the adult is busy, the parents say, gosh, what am I going to do with her? I have to cook dinner. Well, what about a vest with some things that you know she likes and she can sit in the high chair or sit on the chair or lie on the floor, and she'll have something to engage in instead of just her body, so that she's starting to develop concepts. And we're going to talk a lot more next week about concepts. So I want to this is a quick grasping issue. Grasping, there's kind of some developmental steps in the whole concept of grasping. So we're talking about the hand to the mouth, a hand to the hand, objects that are held in the hand, objects held in a hand and put to the mouth, losing objects and then getting them back. How cool that is that we use the elastic so that you're not the one picking it up and being like the little fairy godmother who just automatically, oops, they all reappear. So I assume that somehow if I drop something, it will come back to me. Well, on a piece of elastic, I can find it myself. Objects transferred from one hand to the other, reaching out for objects, knocking objects on the table or on a surface, handling of objects, throwing objects. The idea that I can throw and it'll come back. Am I going to take a big, heavy metal bolt that is nice and heavy and cold and do that? No, I might attach that to the space for active learning by running some elastic through it through the holes on the side of the space for active learning or Lily Nielsen's little room. I might do that so that they have access to it, but that they're not going to sit there and let it go and then come back and bash them in the face. Knocking 2 objects against each other, using the pincer grasp, pointing to objects, taking objects. These are all the different kinds of grasping things that you want kids to start to do if they're capable of it. Building with objects, putting objects inside each other. So remember, this is one thing that I always have to remind myself, and that is sometimes feet and toes work actually better than hands and fingers do, either forever or in the beginning. So doing activities also in different positions. Remember I talked about the person who went into that large space for active learning in a prone stander versus sitting in a wheelchair, or lying down, or sitting like you saw Andy Rose. All those positions actually make those items seem different to a child. And so they need to learn that this item is this item no matter if I'm sitting here and feeling it or if I'm lying down and feeling it. So this is just a quick picture. I'm going to show a video in a few minutes. But this was about a 17-year-old young man. And this use was actually the idea that he would explore with his feet, and his mom told me that he tends to do more with his feet than he does with his hands, because his hands were very busy. Oops, excuse me, I just got caught up here. His hands were very busy. He would get saliva on this hand, and he'd rub it up against the cheek, and then he'd do this little patting thing back and forth, and then so his hands weren't available. He was busy taking care of himself in the way that he knew how to, because I have my body with me all the time. It's one of the reasons some of our kids do behaviors that we identify as self-stimulatory or repetitious, whatever words you want to use, is because I always have my body with me. And if people don't have things for me to engage with, then I'm going to go back to that every time. And the older I get, the more I'm going to stay with those things that I know. So, resonance board. A resonance board is simply a piece of birch plywood. It's a special kind of plywood, so you don't have to sand it and then stain it. And it's small, and it comes right up off the ground. Okay, it's better if it's not on carpet, okay, because that absorbs some of it. But it sort of turns into a mini trampoline in a way, because the body of the child moves, as they move, there's some give and take, almost like a trampoline, just not to the extent. So the purpose is to gain auditory and or kinesthetic motor movement feedback from any activity in which the child engages. So if I'm lying on that resonance board or I'm sitting on it, I'm actually in a place where the minute I move this arm and it's on the board, I get feedback through my whole body. It's vibratory. Objects can be placed on the board, and the board can be used in conjunction with an adapted little room or with space for active learning. The board functions as a trampoline, as I said, for feedback to the body. Now, David Brown explains how to make a resonance board and much more in a great article, and this is a website that you can go to. This is a URL or a link that you can go to. Also, on our website, we have introduction videos, frequently asked questions, and examples of items to use and placement on that board. And any of those items that I showed you earlier, any of those are fine, and any others you come up with. It doesn't just have to be what I showed in those pictures. So you can go to either of those websites, but David Brown shows exactly how to make it. It's an article, and he actually works for the Deafblind Project in California. He is, you know, I can't say enough about him. He's just a magnificent person. He is so good at working with children and explaining things in a very easy manner. I really appreciate David's skills. I'm going to go back one more. We're going to actually show Catherine on a resonance board. You're going to hear some talking in the background, and that's the teacher, and I think it's the paraeducator who was working with her. And it's called Catherine and the Blue Snake. And the blue snake, for those of you who don't know, it's vibratory in nature. You can turn it on, and it will vibrate. So with that, we're going to go to that video. And one other thing I want to say about the resonance board is if I draw a little diagram and put the things in the same place, so I'm going to go back to that whole thing about space for active learning, I can start to find out whether or not the child has a favorite thing and if they always reach in the same place to get it. Also, if I'm lying on that board, then anything I drop next to me is going to tend to come back into my body because there's a little bit of sag from that board. It is flexible and bendable enough. Do you want to step on it and walk over it? No, you do not want to do that. You can make it any size you want, but you'll get more information from David on it. I also will use these underneath the space for active learning because it just gives the child more information. Once again, I would not typically use it on carpeting unless I have to. So this is Catherine, and I'd like you to take a look at her. It's just one item that she's using while she's lying down, but I want you to get a feel for some of the things you see children do. So let's press play now.
And she really likes it wrapped around her, so she can feel it everywhere.
What would you like, Peter?
What happens if you stop pushing it? Will she?
Well, it's set up on a timer, and so when it goes off, then she's got to push the button for more. So we'll see. Press the switch. Okay, now it's off. Let's see if sometimes she'll reach out and do it spontaneously. Otherwise, we've got to almost kind of prompt her a little bit. There you go. And then it's...
Did you?
Did you get that wash
It is big. So the tube is vibrating right now?
The tube is vibrating.
Okay.
And it'll go off. It's like set on maybe 20 to 30 seconds.
I was hearing it before, but now I know.
Yeah. It depends on where it kind of
Yeah.
hits and stuff.
Wash your hands first. Now.
She'll request it.
I'm also curious when it goes off if she stops moving or starts moving. You know what I mean? Is there any change in her behavior? Facial
I've
expression.
noticed more activity when it is vibrating.
Yeah.
She was kicking her, her heel and stuff.
Then you need to get a chair. The chair that's at the table is this.
There you go.
Okay, what was being used as far as the power link goes, they could set it so that it would go ahead and run for 15, 20 seconds, whatever amount of time they want, and then it would kick off automatically. And then if she would request it by pushing the red switch, then she could get it for another, whatever the amount of time they set it for. And it is a specific device that I know AbleNet has it, and I'm sure other places have it. So keep an eye on the chat window because people are saying, oh, you can get this from such and such. That's helpful information that you can write down. The thing I want to mention again is that if you, just as you saw a videotape of me with Glenn last week and I told you all the things I did wrong, the reality of it is I would continue to tell you things that I do wrong. So remember that we're grateful to everybody who's willing for us to show the videos. And one of the things that you want to really be cautious about is I noticed one of the people's knee and hand was on the resonance board. And the minute they move, that information gets broadcast to the rest of the child's body without the child understanding what happened. And if I'm trying to tell you, explain something to you, and I go knock, knock, knock on it, then the child's going to get that, and it's like, where did that come from? We all have to be very careful about the consistency that I've been pressing on you, impressing on you, whatever I need to do to get you to get it, is that inconsistency totally messes up what you're doing. So you want to keep your hands off of it. And it doesn't mean that you can't talk to the child, that you can't do something with the child, but you don't want to be sitting on that unless the child is so fearful that that's the only way you can get them onto the resonance board, and then the idea is to slowly get off, to eventually get out of there and not be a part of it. So once again, I'll just remind you about that we all see things, and when I watch myself on a video, I see all kinds of things I should have done differently too. If you're on the resonance board and you're with the child and you're engaged, it's fine, but sit next to the resonance board. Don't lean into it and make your movements change it. It should be the child making the movement, if I understood your question correctly. So it's not that you can't engage with them. It's not the same thing as the Space for Active Learning or Lily Nielsen's Little Room. You can do many things with the child on it, and you can talk to them. But did you see the conversation going between the two adults? And the teacher was really trying to get some good information about, gosh, you know, I'm trying to figure out, you know, does she smile more? Does she vocalize more when she's on the resonance board, which are all good questions to ask. You know, what is different? Some children I work with who are very passive and don't hardly move will move the most on the resonance board of any other time during the day. Some will vocalize more because you're also getting auditory feedback too from being on that board. People say, well, can I put a blanket on it because the child doesn't like the wood? And my answer is, if that's the only way you can get the child on, yeah, but your goal is to work your way off of that, however you need to. I've seen it where a child was on it for the first time and got scared because they're getting so much feedback as they move that the parent went and put her hand right under the child's, kind of like on her hip, and just went, Mama's here, it's okay. And the child calmed down. Another person I know went and gave the child all familiar things that she loved, that were her favorite things in the beginning, and then slowly replace those with new items. So those are things that you want to do with the resonance board. That's great. I have a deafblind student who loves the pounding I do around him. When I stop, he tries to find my hand, and then when he touches my hand, I will begin pounding again. That's fine. My only goal would be to probably slide my hand under his so he knows that I'm going to pound right now instead of, or I'd come in next to his side, his hip, if that's appropriate, just so he knows that I'm getting ready to pound it and he can feel where the source is. But that's great, that give and take. It's like a conversation. I mean, we're having a conversation about pounding on the wood. Isn't this great? My turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. That's what a conversation is. And I see people in their goals and objectives on IEPs, you know, turn taking. And my response is, this child already takes turns. The one that Marcy was mentioning, this child already takes turns. It just, he didn't take turns in Go Fish, the game you happen to have that day. And pairing it with hand under hand or near his body. So those are all things that you want to think about with the resonance board. I love the resonance board. There's also on LilyWorks, again, and I'm not making any money off of LilyWorks, so please understand that I'm just sharing with you what I know. They actually have a foldable resonance board. And so you can actually make some that fold so it's not so big and cumbersome. Okay? So I want to go on to activity boards. Lily Nielsen talks about scratch boards, which are a little bit different. But the idea is to get, and you can simply use a clipboard if you want, and you put different kinds of textures on it so that the child can feel it. The idea is that they can use their fingers, so they're developing some finger strength on it. And then activity boards And this is an example of one, and I actually brought one very similar. The reason we did it on a clear background was we laid it on what's called a light box. And for those of you who work with kids with vision loss, you'll probably know what that is. But it's actually just a light source, so it would shine through here and get some children's attention more, which is what we were trying to do with this child. I ended up actually using Velcro on this. And the reason I used Velcro on it was I could move things around, and I could also use it with different students. And that may not be what your goal is. It is to use it with the same students. But I wanted to do some things such as something that was long and stringy. I wanted to do something that the child could spin. Sorry, I'm trying to do this backwards. And then I also had a large slinky and then actually a small slinky so that we could be talking about big and little together. And this is often nice to put on a wheelchair tray when it's going to be a few minutes before lunch and that child is simply sitting there and waiting until everybody's ready to go to lunch. It's another way you can use this activity board. So keep in mind you can put anything on it that you want. And then the last one was one that we wanted to come out from it, and it's just a spring, and you can move it. So that's just the concept. What I'd like to do is show a video, and I'm going to go back to, you saw the young man's feet. That was an activity board similar to this one. But I'd like you to see what happens when he, in the beginning, when he was touching, okay, versus later. And I'm hoping to get permission from the mother on some other piece, but I'd really like to show him his whole body. But in this, we're going to watch the feet. So let's keep an eye and see what his feet do with this activity board. So let's push play now. Okay, one of the reasons I wanted to show that was Mom was great about telling me things he liked, and so I found some felt, or whatever you call those, kind of furry pipe cleaners, and then I just stuck some different beads on it, so it actually became, in his case, it actually became something that had more vibratory quality. I also stuck that can on it because I wanted to see if his toes would start to investigate inside the can. That activity board, I did stick at a 90-degree angle against the wall for him to explore. We did use it later when he was in his wheelchair and put it under his foot. He did a little bit different stuff then, but he was still exploring the two major things, and that was the furry little pipe cleaner with some things strung on it and that open metal container. So we were looking for some things that he might explore, and we started with feet. And there is a woman in Colorado, and I may say her name wrong, so for those of you who are teachers of visually impaired, you might correct me. I think it's J.C. Greeley, who has done some great things about babies and using their feet. And it works for older kids, too. It's not just babies. And what I've seen many times is when the feet are doing more, the hands and fingers will start to do more, unless there's a physical reason why the child can't do it. Let's see. So again, the purpose of a scratch board, according to Lily Nielsen, and then expanded to an activity board, is to encourage the child, number one, to bend and stretch his fingers, which helps develop muscle strength in the hands, and it's a prerequisite for grasping. So again, we want to develop the strength because for that child, and I'll sometimes see in a space for active learning or hanging from a board like this, there'll be some big ball, and here are these little hands and they need both of them to barely hold on to it. Keep in mind, look at the size of the hand of the child and what they can do. What size can they grasp and what size can't they grasp? Too often we give them something too big, too unmanageable. Now, triangle boards. Triangle boards, and I gave you so you could see it. All it is cutting 3 pieces of pegboard to the same size. Simply use a mat knife to make a regular slot. And so let me just show you a small piece. But all I did was cut a slot in here between 2 of the pegboard holes so that I could put one side of Velcro that's soft, one side that is the curly. I just stuck them to each other. And that way I can actually slide them through. Just a second. Let me do this. If you make the slot a little bit wider, it's always good. And then what I can do is slide it through the other piece, and that's what holds it together. So let me go back to the picture. So you'll see down in the corner where you see the one that looks like a tent, there's a piece of double-sided, whatever that stuff is called, Velcro, and it's in the center at the end. And these actually are about 18 to 22 inches long and about 12 to 13 inches high. The one on the bottom is the example that I'll talk about as far as you want activities, you want to tie things into that might have a conceptual meaning to it. So in the case of the lower one that's actually white pegboard, those are all different kinds of brushes. So a brush is a brush is a brush, but we do different things with them. They feel different. One kind of a hairbrush is stiff, another kind of hairbrush is soft. All those are some of the concepts we're talking about developing. This was developed actually, an addition to it was done by Marlene Edwards, who is now retired. But what she came up with was she was working with so many kids that she actually put a dowel in that she could slide in and out with each child she worked with. And there's let me see if I can put the little metal thing that you can get at Lowe's, which will pop into that. And if you're really interested in it, I can send you a picture of it. I just didn't have one that I could do, and I can tell you the name of that metal thing that you need to pop in to the pegboard. You can make the pegboard smaller. The only thing is don't go too small because there's not enough space for the hand, or if the child's using their cheek or their forehead or their feet to explore this, you want them to have enough of an expanse that there's something in there. Same thing with the scratch boards. You don't want the texture to be so small that the child's finger barely touches it and now it touches something else. You want to make it big enough that they can really feel it. Same thing with the triangle boards. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to show a video clip of a young man, and once again, you can use this with any age child, but this is a young man who was doing a lot of what some of us would call behaviorism, self-stimulation, whatever you want to call it, and we were trying to get him to be interested in something else and investigate something else. So with that, I just want to stop for just a second. Yes, you can use those plastic locking strips instead of the Velcro. The thing I like about the Velcro is I can simply slide them out and I can fold that triangle board flat. And so for storage, it works better. But if you're going to keep it up and it's going to stay consistently somewhere, those certainly work too. Zip ties I think is basically the same thing. So let's watch him do some exploring using a triangle board, and notice the items that are on there and notice what he's doing with them. Okay? All right. Push play now.
It's normally the time, so 10:18, you normally get them down at this time.
Hey, I'm back. I just had to dance something. Oh, fingers out.
A little cold. Feel the cold. This is light again. Yeah. This one's soft, Mario.
Which hand? The
You reach those, Mario? Soft. Soft.
And Holly, you can just let him go for now, and then we'll talk after, now that you've introduced it. Yeah, thank you. You can hang on to the board, Holly.
Today because I just want to see if it makes a difference next time.
No, I think that's a great idea.
You know, maybe he'll still go towards these, but if we extend it, then we'll know if it's just because those ones were lower. Because he definitely seems to like
Yeah.
chewing on that soft too. That's what's interesting too.
Yes.
So for older students, sometimes it really is about getting them to engage in something other than contact with their body. You could see the kinds of things he was doing because he was so used to not having something to engage with. So for older students, sometimes we see something a little bit different than we do for younger students because they've had so long to develop into how am I going to keep my sensory system interested and alert. And so some of this is about keeping my sensory system alert. And I always have my hand with me. I don't always have other things. And that's part of what all of these active learning items, materials that I'm showing you are about, is there are activities that the child can do. And again, if somebody comes in and looks at it and says to you, well, what are they doing those things for? The answer is they're doing those things because they're learning concepts, they're learning how to reach out and do something themselves instead of it always being us doing something to them or even with them for that matter. I mean, how many of you have said, gosh, if he could just do something on his own for about 5 minutes, I would be thrilled without needing me to be engaged? A bunch of us feel that way. So that is a huge piece of this whole active learning. And I'm sure you saw with the strategies that there were a couple strategies we have talked about that would have been very useful to be used with the triangle board. The idea of going under his hand instead of taking his hand to show him where everything was on that triangle board. The fact that he put his hand up at the top of the triangle board because he knew there were other things on the other side, that could have been the beginning of a behavior that could have turned into a communication of, I'm ready for the other side. So it comes in with communication. You don't just let it go. The other thing that you can do is if you're working on a specific thing, it may be that all those things are hanging down that are in relationship to that theme or that topic. And I just noticed that somebody made that comment. But in the beginning, it was about what he liked. But there, you could do story time the same way that we talked about with the Velcro vest. You could do with the triangle board. You could do with the activity board. It's not that you have to use one or the other. You might use a combination. You might find one works better with the child you're working with. Maybe for him, having light underneath it or at a slant, because there are actual light boxes that you can put up on a slant, that helps keep the child engaged. Using a flashlight on something will many times keep the child more engaged, depending upon what their vision is and how they use their vision. So these are all examples. They're not the only things. So I'm going to just show you a couple pictures of things. These are the directions, and if you want more in-depth detailed directions, I can get those. In fact, I'll make them and we'll send them out. This is a homemade rendition of an item made by Lilyworks, and it's called a support bench. And it's for children to lay over and that they work on something and that their feet can actually be exploring things also. And you can read about that on Lilyworks. This is called a hops address. And the idea is that if it's on and this is something Marlene Edwards knows a great deal about, but it's on a line, and this you do not want to make yourself. You want to buy, okay? And the reason is because you're talking about the issue of the liability, but it's actually on a track, and so that goes right around the child, and he or she can get the sense of what walking is like without somebody trying to hold them under the arms or help them in any way. And you put items on the floor so that the child can be exploring with their feet also. And that's also on Lilyworks' website. This is an example with one of the students I work with. We simply have a little cuff that goes on her, and this is just double-based commercial Velcro. And so what happens is it goes in and around her thumb. This one's a little bit different, but it goes around her thumb so that it stays on. And she can go down, and each one of the items has Velcro on it, so she can go down and pick the one she wants because her hands and her pincer grab are not good. So she can't do that. And I just see where somebody's saying that American Printing House for the Blind has a large square sort of like the one on the floor, which is free. So those are things you want to just keep looking at the chat window when people offer up other ideas. I don't have all the ideas in the world. I'm just sharing with you what I've done myself and what I've seen other people do. And I so appreciate people knowing more stuff than I do and sharing it. It's all about us sharing. So I'd like to remind you that there are some books. There is a videotape that our project has, if you still have a videotape player, a VHS, that talks about some of Lily Nielsen's perceptual aids and gives you more information, especially if you have more interest in it. She also has done The Comprehending Hand, which is a wonderful small book. It's the pink one in the upper right-hand corner. The Space and Self, that's all about the little room or a space for active learning. And then there's also Early Learning Step by Step, and that's an excellent book. Our project has those for those of you who may end up have a student who's on our census. We loan that stuff out to people. And just a reminder, I've got a few more things to share, but someone just put in the SurveyMonkey, so if you don't mind doing an evaluation, that feedback is really useful to us. I'd like to go on to this, and this form will be sent out to you tomorrow along with PowerPoint. It's reflection and action, and now it's your turn. What items or materials do you think will be useful with a student or some students? You don't need to answer me right now, but I'd like you to be thinking about which active learning item do you think might work and why. Don't just identify the item. Think about why that might work. And with Mario, the boy that was working on the triangle board, you saw that a few weeks later they had figured out to run a piece of board inside that triangle board and then to run a vise on it because they could not hold it onto the table because he was so strong and he was doing stuff. Where another child, that might not be necessary at all. You might just run a piece of Dyson onto the table and put it on there and it'll hold. So keep in mind, what items might you want to try using? What would the student outcome be? What would you hope would happen as a result of you doing that? It's not about, I want him to be able to work on the triangle board. It's, what do I want him to be able to do as a result of it? I want him to understand some concepts, hot, cold, big, little, long, short. What are the kinds of concepts that are important to us in our life? And we'll be sending out an outline for next week, which will give you some, I've not only given you some websites you can look at, but I've also given you a couple articles that I think you might find interesting that will be on that attachment. Where would this fit into your student's schedule? When would I do this? When would it make sense for me to do a space for active learning? Where does it make sense for me to do it? So those are things that I'd like you to think about too. You know, you can sit here these 3 sessions so far and you can walk away and say, gosh, those were good ideas, and then we all get back into our busy work life and it gets on the back burner. And so I'm going to really recommend that you think about, what could I use? What could I do? So with that, I'm going to say goodbye. And see you next week. But I also want you to be thinking about how would you fill this out, because we are going to ask that question next week at the beginning. What have you thought about doing? And remember, it is about making these things together while the child's still there. Please remember the evaluation, and to do that, we'd appreciate that. And I just want you to, just mull this over during the week. You don't have to go out and build something right now. Just mull it over in your head and say, did I see something that I think would be useful? And then if you need more information, please feel free to email Michaela or me. If Michaela or somebody, if you would type in my email, I would be happy to get you more specific directions, but not on those last items I showed you. I really recommend you go straight to LilyWorks and look at what it's going to cost to do. It's more intensive financially, but it's definitely worth it. I've seen huge changes in kids who can get upright and be moving even though they don't have the strength in their legs. But if their feet are just touching that floor and that mat, they can start exploring and get the idea of going along that track and what that feels like. So with that, have a great rest of the week, and next Tuesday is our last session in this series, and feel free to email me if you need to, and take care. Have a great week. Bye, everybody.